You're on board the news track, and joining us now is a very special guest, John Barry. He is the author of The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history. He's been on the US government's infectious disease board of experts. He's been consulting with the World Health Organization. Remember, the 1918 pandemic killed between 50 million to 100 million people, and the worst impacted was India. And it was so bad that scientists and doctors at that time said that civilization could have disappeared within just a few more weeks. John Barry has been writing extensively on how the lessons learned from the influenza of 1918 apply to what the world is dealing with in 2020, and he's been across all international media talking about his insights as a medical historian. John Barry, welcome to India Today. I want to start by asking you about the similarities you see between what the world witnessed in 1918 with the Spanish flu and what we're seeing right now, where the influenza has now been in our midst for about 3 months.
Well, there are a lot of similarities. You have an animal virus that jumps species to humans, spread widely throughout the world. The pathology is very similar in terms of how it kills. Both the 1918 virus and this virus, in fact, although they're primarily respiratory viruses, they seem able to infect all sorts of organs. Fortunately, the biggest difference is that this virus is much less virulent, much less lethal than 1918's virus. Another very important difference is time. Influenza's incubation period is 1 to 4 days. Most people get sick at 2 days. This virus's incubation is 2 to 14 days. Most people get sick around 5 or 6 days. They're sick longer. They shed virus longer. So the whole thing stretches out the duration of the problem, which creates enormous management difficulties in terms of how long you have to lock down, coming out of lockdown. On the other hand, that long incubation period also gives you an opportunity to contact trace, which you would not really have in influenza.
But what that means essentially is that the world could be dealing with the coronavirus for far longer than we've had to deal with the previous virus. Is that what your intuition is as well?
Absolutely, yes. This virus is going to be around probably forever, really, unless we get a vaccine that's very, very effective.
This is about warm weather and whether warm weather slows the coronavirus. We're now squarely in the middle of the Indian summer, and a lot of people in India are hoping that because it gets as hot, as is the case with usual flus, that there will be a slowing of the spread of the COVID-19. What's the best research that you have available, and how does this link back to what happened in 1918?
Well, I think we know for a fact with influenza that the temperature does affect the spread. We think, but don't know for certain, that temperature will affect the spread of COVID-19. However, I think the fact that huge percentages of the population are susceptible to the virus is more important than the temperature. In 1918, the second wave, which was a lethal wave, that started in July, midsummer in Switzerland, it ended in January, midsummer in Australia. In Australia, roughly 40% of the population was infected. So I think obviously summer didn't stop the virus. It probably would spread less than it would otherwise, but given so many people who are susceptible to it, I think there will still be very significant spread.
Let's deal with waves, because in 1918, the first wave wasn't quite as dangerous as the second wave, and then there was a big third wave as well. How do those experiences play out in comparison with what we're seeing with COVID-19? Is this really, in some senses, the first wave Could there be a bigger second wave? What's your sense?
Well, first, we've got to remember there's a lot to learn from 1918, but they are different viruses. I think in the first wave in 1918, it was very spotty. Much of the world did not see any influenza in the spring at all. Probably most of the world didn't see it. I think the virus was probably still adapting to humans. It wasn't really efficient at infecting them. COVID-19 is more contagious than any influenza virus that we know about. It's more contagious. It's almost twice as contagious as ordinary seasonal flu, and it's significantly more contagious and more easily spread than even the 1918 virus. We didn't really have a full first wave in COVID-19. Most countries locked down, which interrupted the spread of the wave. So it's kind of like putting something in a toothpaste tube that wants to get out. We've squeezed it shut. As we release that, toothpaste is still going to come out of the tube. How rapidly it spreads, I think, is going to be determined by what we do, what individuals do in terms of social distancing, and in terms of wearing masks, in terms of washing their hands, and staying home when sick, and so forth. If we do those things with real discipline, then we can keep this tamped down significantly. If we don't, then in a worst case, we could have a new explosion of cases, and it might be so many that it would get out of control. We wouldn't be able to contact trace, and then we would have a very, very difficult time.
The point that you made was that susceptibility to you seemed a more important factor than seasons, because in 1918, the whole population, especially young and old people in every continent, was susceptible to the disease. Can you explain more in detail about what happened way back in 1918 and what import this has to the crisis that we're dealing with when it comes to susceptibility of our population? What makes someone more susceptible or less susceptible in the coronavirus crisis?
Well, of course, I think you just explained it yourself pretty well. It's a new virus. In 1918, I think there was some cross protection from people having been exposed to earlier influenza viruses. That's why I think the case mortality in the West was significantly lower than in the rest of the world, because they had seen a lot of influenza in the West. Right now, nobody has ever seen anything really like this virus. I mean, there are several coronaviruses that cause the common cold, but there really isn't much evidence of any cross protection from that. Everyone's susceptible. The disease, however, is more dangerous, of course, to older people and people who have some underlying condition. We've known that almost from the beginning. I'm sure your audience already knows that. Oddly enough, in 1918, it was the reverse. In 1918, it was young people. Roughly 2/3 of the dead were aged 18 to 45. And the peak age for death in 1918 was 28. That's the reverse of normal influenza, and it's also the reverse, pretty much, of COVID-19.
Why do you think that was the case in 1918? Because usually you'd imagine that younger people have greater immunity. Why was that not the case then?
Well, the leading hypothesis for that, in my view, involves the immune system itself. As you probably know, the immune system changes as you get older. It's strongest when you're a young adult. And the 1918 virus, like COVID-19, but unlike ordinary influenza or unlike the common cold coronaviruses, it could bind to cells inside your lung. Most influenza viruses only bind to the upper respiratory tract. COVID-19 also binds to the upper respiratory tract. That's why it's easily transmissible, but it also deep inside the lung. So in 1918, the immune system of young people was throwing every weapon it had at the virus. And those are quite a few weapons. And in the battlefield was the lung. Essentially, the immune system, in many cases, was destroying the lung in its attempt to destroy the virus. In addition, I think probably most people actually died of bacterial pneumonia, secondary bacterial infections. But again, the immune system had been largely attacked by, or decimated by the virus itself, and it led to it was easy for bacteria to spread in the lung.
The other thing that you're writing about is mutation, and how in the third wave, even if you had exposure in the first and the second, people still got bitten by the influenza virus. So what are you making of, explain mutation that happened at that time, and also how that applies to what we're seeing with COVID-19?
Well, fortunately, that's another major difference between the two viruses. The influenza virus is one of the fastest mutating viruses in existence. And if you were infected in the first wave, you had very good protection against the second wave virus, much better actually than any modern vaccine. But neither infection in the first or second wave protected you against the third wave in actually that third wave came in 1919. Coronavirus is much more stable, fortunately. That's one reason people are optimistic about developing a vaccine. It does mutate, but at a much slower rate. Also, probably the target for a lot of vaccines and for the immune system is what's called the spike protein, and that seems to be particularly stable. So, there is some mutation with the coronavirus, but I don't think virologists expect much significant change in the virus. So vaccines should be pretty effective. We certainly hope so.
Let's come now to restarting the economy, because we can't possibly wait for everyone to develop herd immunity or wait till we get a vaccine. What are the lessons from 1918 in what happened in different parts of the world, which can teach us about how to approach the question of restarting our economies?
Well, it's not too much of a precedent, unfortunately. Going back to what I said earlier about the speed, in 1918, a particular community, influenza, would go through that community in 6 to 10 weeks. It's much slower process here. The lockdowns are longer. So it's going to be more difficult now than it was in 1918. However, and I'm not sure about the rest of the world, but there have been studies of economic recoveries in 1918, and it was found that cities that locked down the longest in 1918 actually had a much better economic recovery than those cities that were locked down for a shorter period.
Can you build on that, please? Give us more examples. Establish the point that you're making, because that's a question that every city, every town in India is dealing with. Government wants to extend the lockdown. A lot of people getting very restless and frustrated. They want the lockdowns to end. So go back in time, if you can, John, and explain why you think that cities that stayed locked down bounced back even economically faster than cities which were in a hurry to open up.
Well, it's only speculation. I don't really fully understand that. It could have something to do with local leadership. It also could have something to do with mortality. If the cities had fewer deaths, and remember, these are people aged 18 to 45, peak age 28, sort of the most productive people in the society. So it's conceivable if they had fewer deaths, then they were able to come back faster. But again, there could be other factors, such as leadership, and again, speculation. However, there have been several analyses, all of which have came to the same conclusion, that the longer the lockdown in 1918, the better the recovery.
That's an important point that you make. You've been focusing on a lot of non-pharmaceutical interventions. And I want to deal with what happened in India, because India got the worst bout of the Spanish flu.
Right.
And what are the lessons specifically about the different parts of India which were ravaged by the flu that you think are important for our viewers to reflect on?
Well, unfortunately, I don't really know in detail what happened in different parts of India. I do know this, where the statistics are good, and that is certainly not in all of India by any stretch. But Indian troops versus British troops at the same post that had more than twice the case mortality rate. I'm not sure exactly why that would be. It could go back to what I said earlier, that possibly no earlier influenza virus had circulated in the country. There could be genetic reasons. There could be environmental reasons. Medical treatment would not account for it, because medical treatment was essentially useless for anyone in 1918.
Let's now come to schools. You've spent a lot of time studying and reading about how schools opened, how it was safe or unsafe, and then how they had to be reshut. And then can you just shed some light into what happened in 1918 and the lessons this holds for now?
Well, that's another one where the differences in the virus are important. It's very clear that in influenza, that children are so-called super spreaders and do amplify the disease. It's one reason why one of the first moves that a lot of governments around the world made was to close schools, thinking that it was the same way with coronavirus. That is not clear in coronavirus, which makes it much more controversial as to whether to keep schools open or reopen them, or to keep them closed. Kids do get sick, or they get infected. We are now seeing different complications in the West anyway that were not reported in China in terms of illness among children. I'm glad I don't have to make a decision on schools, frankly. It is a very tricky situation. I think Denmark, for example, has reopened schools, but they've done it in a very rational way in terms of consulting with the teachers' unions, in terms of having testing available to make sure that kids who are infected are not going to school and so forth. And it can be done, I guess, but you have to be very careful about it. And there's a lot of data that we don't have on kids that we're still trying to gather so that we can make an informed decision.
The other
Very
thing
difficult
I found very interesting, Mr. Barry, is your study on the difference in morbidity and mortality between army camps that very strictly followed rules and those
Right.
that didn't follow orders because they became, so the point that you make, and I want you to explain that to our viewers, is that ultimately there's very little difference, because an army camp that followed rules very tightly and one that didn't, in the end they both got an equally bad bout, just happened faster or slower. What basically then that means is we're going to get it in any case, and therefore whether we're really anal about how serious we are about following the rules or not doesn't really matter in the long run. Is that the conclusion?
No, I think it's the reverse. If you go back to the numbers in Wuhan versus the rest of China, the case fatality in Wuhan was 5.8%. The case fatality in the rest of China was 0.7%. And the difference was that in Wuhan, the healthcare system was overwhelmed. In the rest of China, the healthcare system was not overwhelmed. If you needed an intensive care unit bed, you got it. So if we so-called flatten the curve, a phrase I'm sure you and your audience are familiar with, then that will allow the healthcare system to continue to function normally. Being anal, as you said, about these things is very important to prevent that. We also have, and remember, the army camps, particularly back in 1918, much less so today in most armies and modern armies, the close quarters of an army training camp makes it extremely difficult to control a disease. The fact that they could make any progress in an army camp, I think, is pretty remarkable. A civilian community is not that densely populated. You have much more opportunity to control disease. And I'd also look to SARS. Roughly over 20% of the people who died in SARS were healthcare workers. When the George W. Bush administration started a major effort on pandemic preparedness, they asked me to participate in the early conceptualizing of that. And at the very first meeting we had, the infection control leader from the single hospital in the world, happened to be in Hong Kong, that had a lot of SARS cases, but also had the best record in healthcare workers surviving and not getting sick. And what he told us was, every hospital in the world knows how to do infection control. He didn't do anything different. He just made sure that in his hospital, healthcare workers did the right thing all the time, every time. It was really a question of discipline. And in his hospital, people survived, and in other hospitals, too many of those workers died. So we can do the same thing here. We do have the ability to exercise considerable control over this disease. Going back to what I said at the beginning, if when we come out of lockdown, or while we're still in lockdown, social distancing, hand washing, masks, staying home when you're sick, things like that will definitely have an impact on the spread of this disease. None of those things are magic wands that make it go away. But if all of you do everything right, cumulatively, you can have a real impact on transmission of the disease.
The one thing that you focus on, which interests me, is about, and that's very relevant to what's happening in India at this time, is about imposing restrictions, lifting them too soon, and having to reimpose them. So go back in time, John, and explain what happened in different cities back in 1918 and the lessons that reopening too soon could have for people who are watching you right now.
Right. Well, again, we're facing exactly the same questions in the United States. In 1918, many cities, almost every city closed down. Actually, we're taking more extreme measures in most countries right now than they took in 1918. But I can't give you an exact number. I'd have to go back to check. But I do know many, many cities had, whether it was a majority of cities or 80% of cities or 40% of the cities, a lot of them had to reissue the closing orders 2 or 3 or 4 weeks later because the virus came back and there was another surge. In a few cases, they actually did that 3 times. They closed, reopened, closed, reopened, closed, reopened. And again, there were the same economic pressures and the same fact that people wanted to get out in 1918 that we're experiencing today, even more so because in 1918 they didn't have internet, they didn't have TV, in many cases they didn't even have a telephone. So being cooped up was much worse than it is now. Nonetheless, these cities, many of them did have to reclose. Same pressures today, same issues today. I am concerned that in the United States, I guess right now, possibly all 50 states have taken some steps to reopen. I think in some cases it's the right thing to do. I think it's premature in too many cases. When I say cases, I mean too many states. We will see what happens.
Okay.
I hope that I'm wrong.
Finally, the other thing that you focus on is the need to tell the truth. How in 1918, not telling the truth created all manner of problems. Explain some of those and why those lessons are relevant for governments right now about the need for full disclosure and transparency.
Well, in 1918, because of World War I, all the governments that were involved in the war pretty much lied to the public, first trying to trivialize the pandemic. The result of that was people died who would otherwise have lived because they didn't take any precautions initially. That was the first result. The second result in 1918, which probably doesn't apply today, that first one does apply today. In 1918, it was so virulent a virus, so lethal, that it spread a kind of panic that doesn't really exist today. There's concern, but not that kind of panic that in the worst cases almost led to dissolution of society. You had a quote at the opening of this interview, from a serious, sober scientist who had said, if this disease continues to accelerate at the same pace for a few more weeks, civilization could easily disappear from the face of the earth. That's not going to happen this time. The virus is just not that deadly. Nonetheless, and by not telling the truth, certain governments, it does encourage people not to comply with the social distancing. That's certainly the case in the United States, where Trump and TV network for several months minimized the virus, and now instead of setting an example by wearing a mask, Trump doesn't wear a mask. A lot of the people around him don't wear masks. That is not a good example to set. So a significant portion of the American public is following Trump's example rather than complying with the public health recommendations.
We have many problems in India, but mercifully, irresponsible leadership isn't one of them. John Barry, this has been a very interesting conversation. Your ability to go back in medical history, explain what happened then, especially in the context of the crisis that's playing out live. We're actually in the middle of history being made, and your ability to go back and forth in time is truly remarkable. You were candid about so many things you know and so open about what you don't. I deeply, deeply appreciate you taking out time. John Barry, author of the hugely popular and now best-selling once again book, The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history, for joining us in India Today. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Hello everyone, this is Rahul Kanwal here. Hope you enjoyed this video. For the latest news and analysis, like and subscribe the India Today YouTube channel, and don't forget to press the bell icon to stay updated.